My mother-in-law had our family portrait professionally edited to erase me, cropped me out, photoshopped her own sister into my place, standing next to my husband and my children. She hung it over the fireplace like I had never existed. What she didn't know was the photographer still had the untouched original and the time-stamped proof of exactly what she paid to change. My name is Rachel. For 8 years, my mother-in-law Barbara made me feel like a guest in my own marriage. The portrait was supposed to be a fresh start. Instead, it became the evidence that unraveled everything, including a trust worth $2 million she was quietly trying to cut me out of. I met Joshua at a mutual friend's wedding in 2015. He was warm, steady, the kind of man who remembers your coffee order after one date. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony at a vineyard. His mother, Barbara Warcream, made a toast that was really a lament about losing her son and hugged me just long enough to whisper, "I hope you're up for the job." I smiled. I didn't know then that the job was surviving her. For the next 8 years, Barbara waged a quiet campaign, passive-aggressive comments, birthday cards addressed only to Joshua, forgetting to include me in family group texts. When I gave birth to our daughter, Lily, she posted a picture of her, Joshua, and the baby with the caption, "My son is the best father." I wasn't cropped out of the photo. I just wasn't in the room when she took it. Joshua always said his mother was difficult, that her husband's death 10 years earlier had left her controlling. What I didn't know was that his grandfather had established a significant trust before he died, one that would distribute $2 million to Joshua's family upon Barbara's 65th birthday, which was 8 months away. And Barbara was the trustee. The trust terms were specific: distribution to Joshua, his spouse, and any biological children. Barbara viewed me as a clause she needed to rewrite. She began dropping hints that Joshua should consider a postnuptial agreement. She told family members I was unstable, citing the time I cried at Thanksgiving because she'd served a dish I was allergic to. But she needed something tangible, something visual to make her case stick. That's when she suggested the family portrait. A gesture of unity, she called it. I agreed because I thought it might finally quell the tension. I was wrong. The photographer was a woman named Maria, a local professional Barbara hired. For 2 hours, we posed in Barbara's meticulously decorated living room. Joshua, Lily, our son Ethan, Barbara in the center, and me on the end. Barbara insisted on that arrangement. I remember her saying, "Rachel, you're so tall, you'll balance the frame perfectly on the edge." I didn't fight it. Maria was professional, calm. Something felt off when Barbara pulled her aside after the session and they spoke in lowered voices, but I assumed it was about payment. I didn't push. I should have. 2 weeks later, Barbara invited us over for Sunday dinner. When I walked into the living room, I saw it. A massive canvas print hung above the fireplace. My children, my husband. And instead of me standing next to them was Barbara's sister, Patricia. Patricia lives 3 states away. She wasn't at the shoot, yet there she was, photoshopped into my spot like I had never existed. Every detail of my presence removed. The position of my body replaced. My children smiling next to a stranger. Barbara watched me from the doorway with a small, satisfied smile. She wanted me to see it. This was the opening move. I didn't confront her. I thanked her for dinner, kissed my kids goodnight, and went home to think. The next morning, I called Maria. She answered on the first ring, and her voice was shaky. She said she'd been hoping I would reach out. Maria told me that after the session, Barbara had paid her a substantial additional fee to perform the edit, cropping me out entirely and inserting Patricia from a separate photo. Maria kept the original, untouched file. She also kept Barbara's written edit request, a document with timestamps and payment confirmation. "I'm a photographer," Maria said, "not a collaborator in cruelty. I saved everything." I had the evidence, the original photograph, the edit order. Proof that Barbara had paid to digitally erase me from my own family. But I didn't yet know what she intended to do with that portrait. That came 2 days later, when a friend at the family's estate planning firm slipped me a note. Barbara was preparing to present the altered photograph to the family attorney as evidence that my position in the household was unstable and that I was voluntarily absent from family representation. The trust distribution meeting was in 6 weeks. She intended to argue I was no longer a recognized family member, removing my share entirely. The portrait wasn't just a photograph. It was a legal weapon, and I was the target. I had 6 weeks until the trust distribution meeting. 6 weeks to expose a forgery before it erased me legally as thoroughly as Barbara had erased me visually. That night, I called Maria back. I needed more than the original file. I needed everything. Maria understood immediately. She sent me a folder with 3 things: the untouched portrait, the edited version, and a scan of Barbara's handwritten edit request on the studio letterhead. The request said, in Barbara's sharp cursive, "Please remove Rachel from the family portrait and insert my sister Patricia from the attached photo. This is urgent for legal documentation. I will pay an additional $1,000 for rush delivery." The date stamp was the day after our photo shoot. She'd been planning this before we even posed. I printed 3 copies of everything, stored digital backups in 3 places, and then I did something Barbara would never expect. I stayed quiet. I needed to know exactly how deep this went. My friend at the estate planning firm, a paralegal named Diane, agreed to gather information off the record. What she found made my stomach drop. Barbara had filed a formal motion with the trustee, her own attorney, to amend the distribution list based on what she called a material change in family composition. She'd submitted the altered portrait as Exhibit A, along with a sworn statement claiming I had abandoned the family and that Patricia had stepped in as a maternal figure for the children. She argued that the trust's language, spouse, no longer applied, and that my share should be redirected to Patricia. Patricia, who'd never changed a single diaper, was about to receive $500,000 meant for me. But Diane also found something else buried in the trust files. 6 years earlier, when Joshua and I were engaged, Barbara had attempted to insert a clause requiring any spouse to pass a family integration review before qualifying for distribution. She'd been overruled by her late husband's original instructions, which explicitly included the spouse of any biological descendant. That fight was documented. Barbara had been trying to gatekeep me out of the family money since before there was even a ring on my finger. This wasn't a moment of cruelty. It was a decade-long campaign, and she'd finally found her weapon. I confronted Joshua that weekend. I sat him down at the kitchen table and laid out the evidence: the original photograph, the edit order, the trust amendment, his mother's handwriting. He stared at the documents without speaking for almost a full minute. Then he said, "She told me you'd been distant lately. She said you were talking about leaving." I asked him if he believed her. He looked at the picture, at his sister Patricia photoshopped where I should have been, and something in his face cracked. "She's been doing this my whole life," he whispered. "I just didn't want to see it." He told me about the photographs she'd destroyed after his father died, the letters from relatives she'd intercepted, the way she'd cut off his college girlfriend by spreading rumors. Barbara curated her reality, and anyone who didn't fit was removed. Now we were both awake. The trust meeting was 5 weeks away. We had the truth, but Barbara had the law on her side, at least temporarily. The trustee was her own attorney, a man who'd worked for her for 15 years. He would rubber stamp anything she presented. We needed to move fast. We hired a forensic document examiner to authenticate the edit order and the chain of custody for the original photograph. We obtained affidavits from Maria and from a colleague who had witnessed Barbara's behavior at family events. Everything was building toward a single moment: the distribution hearing where Barbara planned to hand over the altered portrait as if it were truth. But 3 days before that hearing, I received a call that changed everything. Barbara had found out we were gathering evidence. And she'd made her next move. She reported me to Child Protective Services, claiming I was emotionally unstable and endangering the children. A social worker was coming to our house the next morning. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in Lily's room, watching her breathe, and I imagined a stranger in a government office deciding whether I was fit to be her mother. At 7 in the morning, I called our attorney, a woman named Elaine who specialized in family law and had seen her share of weaponized CPS reports. She told me to stay calm, to let the social worker in, to be cooperative, and above all, to document everything. "This is a classic escalation pattern," she said. "When someone realizes they're losing control, they try to control the narrative through institutions. Stay grounded. The truth is on your side." Easy to say. Harder to do when your entire identity as a mother is about to be scrutinized because of a photograph. The social worker arrived at 10, a woman named Ms. Reeves with kind eyes and a clipboard full of questions. She asked to see the house, the children's rooms, the kitchen. She asked Lily about her favorite foods and Ethan about his stuffed dinosaur. She talked to us together and separately. I was terrified, but I answered every question directly. And then, halfway through the interview, I did something I hadn't planned. I showed her the photograph, the edited one hanging over Barbara's fireplace. I didn't say it was evidence of a conspiracy. I just said, "This is what my mother-in-law considers a family portrait. My daughter asked who the woman was standing where I should be." Ms. Reeves looked at the image for a long time. She asked for a copy. Then she closed her file and said, "I'll be recommending no further action. This report appears to be retaliatory." I nearly collapsed with relief, but the war wasn't over. Barbara's CPS gambit had failed, but it told me something crucial. She was desperate, and desperation makes people sloppy. That same afternoon, Diane from the trust firm called with another discovery. While going through archived communications, she'd found something in a sealed file that the trustee had marked as internal correspondence. It was a memo from 3 years earlier, written by Barbara's own attorney, warning her that the altered photograph plan could constitute fraud if used in a legal proceeding. The attorney had advised her not to attempt it. She'd done it anyway, and she'd concealed that memo from the current filing. This wasn't just a pattern of boundary violations. This was a premeditated fraud with written evidence of intent. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd once felt like a guest in my own home, and I realized something that rearranged everything I knew about the last 8 years. Barbara hadn't just been trying to push me out. She had been systematically purging evidence of anyone who threatened her control over the family narrative. Joshua's college girlfriend hadn't just been the victim of rumors. After she and Joshua broke up, a photograph of her at a family wedding had been altered to remove her, replaced with a distant cousin. The college girlfriend, a woman named Claire, had written a letter to Joshua after the breakup, but he never received it. Barbara had intercepted it. Diane found a copy of that letter in the same sealed file, along with notes Barbara had written on it. "She's not suitable. Redirect to Patricia." Patricia was not a sister stepping in out of love. She was Barbara's lifelong enforcer, the person she used to occupy spaces she wanted to empty. The scale of the manipulation took my breath away. This wasn't just about me or the trust. It was a decades-long campaign to erase women from the family line unless they submitted to Barbara's control. My mother-in-law wasn't a difficult person. She was an archivist of her own false reality, and I was the latest entry in her catalog of deletions. But I was also the one who had the original file. Joshua, after learning all of this, went through his own reckoning. He called Claire. They talked for an hour, and he learned that she had spent years believing he'd ghosted her. He apologized for something he hadn't even known he'd done. Then he called Patricia, his own aunt, and the conversation was short. He said, "I know about the photo edits. I know about the trust. If you testify on Barbara's behalf, we will present the full file, including your role in all the earlier erasures." Patricia didn't admit anything, but she didn't deny it either. She just said, "I did what Barbara asked. Family is complicated." He hung up. The noose was tightening, but not around my neck anymore. 2 days before the distribution hearing, we organized our evidence into a binder. The original portrait, the altered version, the edit request with Barbara's handwriting, Maria's affidavit, the attorney's warning memo, the intercepted letter to Claire, and the CPS report that had been dismissed. We added something else, too. A psychologist's expert report on the psychological impact of digital erasure in family dynamics, citing boundary violation studies and the normalization of control through image manipulation. I wanted the trustee to understand that this wasn't just about money. It was about a woman who used a digital scalpel to cut people out of existence. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully, not for fashion, but for armor. Joshua held my hand as we walked into the conference room where Barbara was already seated, her attorney beside her, Patricia in the corner like a prop. Barbara smiled when she saw us, that same small, satisfied smile I'd seen the day of the portrait reveal. She still thought she was going to win. She didn't know that the photographer, Maria, was waiting outside with the original file, ready to be called as a witness. She didn't know that Elaine had already filed a motion to remove Barbara as trustee for breach of fiduciary duty. And she didn't know that every photograph tells 2 stories, the one you choose to see and the one that survives the edit. The hearing began exactly on time. Barbara sat across the conference table in a navy blazer, her silver hair set perfectly, hands folded. Her attorney, a man named Gerald, opened with a rehearsed statement about unfortunate family drift and the need to update distribution to reflect current relationships. He slid the altered portrait across the table like it was a sworn affidavit. Barbara didn't look at me. She looked at the trustee, an older man named Mr. Collins who'd managed the family's affairs for 20 years. He nodded slowly, picking up the photograph. Then Elaine stood. Mr. Collins, before we proceed with this documentation, we'd like to introduce Exhibit B. She placed Maria's original photograph on the table, the real one with me in it. Then she placed the edit request beside it, Barbara's handwriting clear as a signature. Barbara's face didn't change, but her hand, resting on the arm of her chair, went white at the knuckles. Gerald opened his mouth, but Elaine continued. We also have a signed affidavit from the photographer, Maria Vasquez, who is waiting outside, confirming that Mrs. Barbara Morrison paid her to digitally remove Rachel Morrison from the portrait and insert Patricia Langley. We have the time-stamped payment confirmation. And we have this. She placed the attorney's warning memo on the table, the one where Gerald himself had advised Barbara not to use the edited photograph in any legal proceeding. The silence in that room was absolute. Mr. Collins put on his reading glasses and examined each document one by one. He looked at Barbara. He looked at Gerald. Then he said, "Mrs. Morrison, do you have any explanation for this?" Barbara's smile had disappeared. She said nothing. Gerald leaned over and whispered something. She shook her head. Finally, she spoke, voice tight. "I was trying to protect my son's inheritance from someone who doesn't belong in this family." Joshua, sitting beside me, set his hand flat on the table. "She's my wife, Mom. She belongs. The only person who doesn't belong is you in our lives if you can't accept that." Gerald tried to pivot, arguing that the trust allowed the trustee discretion, that the photograph was merely illustrative. But Mr. Collins had seen enough. He announced that he would not entertain the distribution amendment, that the original terms would stand, and that he would be referring the matter of the falsified documentation to the probate court for review. He also notified Barbara that, given the evidence of fraud, a motion to remove her as trustee would be expedited. Barbara's empire of paper collapsed in under 12 minutes. But the most surprising moment came after the hearing, when we were packing up the evidence. Mr. Collins approached me privately. He told me that the trust had a clause Harold Morrison, Joshua's grandfather, had inserted personally, a clause no one had ever needed to invoke. It stated that any beneficiary who attempted to defraud another beneficiary would automatically forfeit their own share, and that share would be redistributed equally among the remaining beneficiaries. Barbara didn't know about that clause. Neither did Gerald. Harold had written it in as a final safeguard against exactly this kind of manipulation. He'd seen his daughter-in-law clearly, even if no one else had. By attempting to erase me, Barbara had erased herself from the trust entirely. Her share, over $600,000, would now be divided between Joshua, our children, and, ironically, me. I thought about Harold, a man I'd never met, who had died years before I entered this family. He'd left a legal time capsule designed to protect the people he hadn't even known yet. Just like Maria, the photographer who refused to delete what was true. Just like the original file that outlasted the lie. When we got home that evening, I took the real portrait out of its protective sleeve. Joshua had already taken down the empty frame Barbara had given us, the one with Patricia's face in it. We hung the original in our living room above our fireplace. Lily pointed at it and said, "There's Mommy." "Yes, baby. There I am." 2 weeks later, we moved out of the house we'd been renting from Barbara and found a place of our own, closer to Joshua's work, with a big yard and a porch swing. The CPS case was closed with an official finding of unsubstantiated and retaliatory. Patricia sent a brief, awkward letter of apology, saying she'd been manipulated too. I didn't reply. Some relationships can't be restored just because someone stops pretending they weren't complicit. As for Barbara, she lost the trusteeship, her share of the trust, and any remaining claim on our time. But I don't think about her much anymore. I think about the photograph. Every day, I walk past it and remember that someone tried to erase me, and failed, because a stranger decided that the truth was worth keeping. That's not just a story about family. It's a story about the power of original files, in all their mess and truth, to outlast any edit. I think a lot about what it means to be erased from a photograph. It's more than pixels. It's someone telling you that your presence is inconvenient, that your place in the story isn't real. Barbara tried to rewrite history with an editing tool and $1,000. But she forgot that original files exist. They exist in cameras. They exist in memories. They exist in the quiet stubbornness of a photographer who refused to delete what was true, and in a grandfather she never met who hid a clause in a document to protect someone he'd never know. Not everyone gets that kind of safeguard. Many people are erased from narratives every day, by bitter exes, by gaslighting parents, by bosses who rewrite credit, and they have no way to prove the original was ever there. So if there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this: keep your own originals. Keep the screenshots, the emails, the time-stamped photographs, the unedited truth of your life. You may never need them, but if someone tries to crop you out, you'll be glad you have proof that you were always in the frame. Now I want to hear from you. Has someone ever tried to erase you from a story, a family, a moment that belonged to you? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this video mattered to you, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time below too. I love knowing where you're listening from. This is Rachel, and this has been my story.